You can't get anywhere these days without coming into contact with a statistic on America's unemployment rate, or another experiment on toothpaste promising that it will change your life forever. Only $2.98. Just the other day, I was reading about a science experiment on the anatomy of panic conducted through a false Mars invasion. It's experiments similar to these that put into my head the question, what is the most scientifically studied topic? After a few minutes on Google, I learned that the most researched issue known to man is a piece of cloth, commonly known as the Shroud of Turin. We're going to be dividing this expository speech into two questions. The first being, what exactly is the Shroud of Turin? And the second, is it authentic or not? So going to the first portion of this speech, what is it? The Shroud of Turin is a dirty, dusty old piece of cloth that would never incite a second glance. However, this old cloth is often assumed to be the same burial cloth of Jesus Christ placed over him after his death and crucifixion in the year 33 AD. The first historical reference made to this shroud is actually from the book of John, chapter 20, verse 5. It's Easter morning when the disciple John comes astounded to the open tomb of Jesus and, quote, saw the burial cloths there but did not go in. And here's the part where things start to get interesting. Whatever became of those burial cloths that John is speaking of? In that same year, a disciple named Thaddeus traveled from Jerusalem to Edessa, which is today eastern Turkey, supposedly bringing the burial cloth with him. He gave it to the city's ruler, Abgar V, who had a correspondence with Jesus during his lifetime. From then until the year 1578, it did quite a bit of moving around. The cloth traveled all over Europe, staying in various chapels along the way, and a few times completely disappearing. In fact, at one point after the Crusades, it simply vanished until it was rediscovered over 100 years later. It is because of these years that the cloth remained absent from history that skeptics choose to doubt its claim to being the burial cloth of Christ. Over the next 320 years, the history regarding the shroud remains somewhat, to put it lightly, dull. So for the sake of our sanity and the 10-minute time restraint, we're going to jump ahead to the day of May 28, 1898, when Secondo Pia, an Italian photographer, made the first photograph of the shroud. Naturally, this cloth had accrued quite a few stories concerning its authenticity over the years. It was really the burial cloth of Christ in name and legend only. When looked at, all that was visible was an old stained piece of cloth. So the only people who accepted its authenticity as fact were believers who were familiar with its history. When Pia photographed the shroud, he decided that it might be interesting if he made a negative image of it as well. He never thought, however, that the resulting effects would be what they were. At around 9:30 that night, he went into his studio to check in his newly developed images, and history tells us that at that moment, he almost dropped and broke the photographic plate from the shock of what that negative image produced. The perfect representation of a man tortured and crucified. After giving to the world what was considered visible proof of the shroud's validity, it's surprising how much controversy concerning its authenticity still existed. But after it became visible that this piece of cloth was in fact something unique, it became the focus of skeptics, believers, and scientists, and remains so even today. There are quite a few legitimate arguments against the shroud's validity. We're now going to list a few of the most probable and examine each one as a potential answer to this question. First of all is the argument against the actual image. This statement claims that the image on the cloth was painted during the year 1389 by a very clever Italian artist able to comprehend and exercise the knowledge of negative imagery. Some even think Leonardo da Vinci was the one who produced this illustration. So the question is there any paint on the cloth? Let's jump ahead to the year 1978 to when a group of 31 scientists conducted a round-the-clock examination on the shroud that lasted a straight 120 hours. Talk about caffeine overdose. As Barry Schwartz, one of the team members, described it, a total of 120 continuous hours of testing is done, with team members working on different parts of the shroud simultaneously. This is the most in-depth series of tests ever performed on the Shroud of Turin. The team concluded with a final report in 1981 saying no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found in the fibrils. If it is impossible to have created the image on the shroud by any of these means, where did this image come from? One theory, commonly accepted by Christian scientists, is radiation. Let me expand on this. In the Gospel, Jesus takes his apostles, Peter, James, and John, up to the top of a mountain to pray. Jesus, wanting to substantiate the faith of these apostles so as to be able to withstand his upcoming death and crucifixion, revealed for the very first time to a human being the heavenly aspect of his nature. As it says in Luke 9:29, while he was praying, his face changed in appearance and his clothing became dazzling white. After he returned to his earthly form, the poor apostles were somewhat shaken, and for a brief time afterwards, Jesus was still emanating some of this light. When Jesus returned to his physical body on Easter morning, he had just spent 3 days in his heavenly form. The theory propounded by Christian scientists is that he had been radiating this same light when he returned to Earth, leaving these supposedly radiated images on his burial cloth. It kind of makes you think, doesn't it? That maybe there is more to this piece of cloth than the talents of an earthly artist. There is one way to ascertain the age of an object. A radiocarbon dating test discerns chemically the age of its subject. In the year 1988, a radiocarbon dating test was taken on a 3-strand sample of the shroud by the universities of Oxford and Arizona and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. When finished with their testing, these researchers came to the conclusion that the shroud was medieval, most likely made between the years 1260 and 1390 AD. So much for 33 AD, right? The world was convinced when the New York Times announced it as a hoax once and for all. However, when the sample on the shroud was taken, one minor mistake was being made. Remember all of the traveling the shroud did from the 6th to the 16th centuries? Well, the cloth certainly got its exercise, but not without a little damage done. In fact, in studies conducted between 2001 and 2008, significant evidence was found of invisible mending done due to damages on the shroud. The carbon dating did not prove that the shroud itself was medieval. It proves that the strands taken from the shroud were medieval. Raymond Rogers, a chemist and one of the team members who examined the shroud in 1988, said about the radiocarbon dating, quote, "The sample chosen for dating was totally invalid for determining the true age of the shroud. In other words, at some point in the Middle Ages, the cloth was in need of mending. A few hundred years later, a group of researchers tested a sample from the mended area on the shroud and came to the conclusion that the shroud itself was from the Middle Ages. After further research, Raymond Rogers found that the shroud was between 1,300 and 3,000 years old, thus proving the radiocarbon dating completely fallacious. When you look at the Shroud of Turin, you'll see that there are several brown markings in a few areas on the cloth. A sample of this material was tested, and the substance was found to be human blood with the female XX chromosome. So logically, this fabric could not have been the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, right? For just a brief moment, let's go to the first chapters of the book, Matthew and Luke. Here we find the story of the Incarnation, where the promise made to mankind in the book of Genesis is finally fulfilled. The Savior comes to earth for the first time through a young virgin who has accepted the responsibility to be the mother of God. 9 months later, this virgin gives birth to a child. From a Christian's perspective, this double X chromosome makes perfect sense. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. God is not a physical being, so if Jesus were the son of a virgin, all of his DNA came from his mother alone, including his blood type. There is no definite answer to what the history of the Shroud of Turin really contains. The purpose of this speech is not to persuade you to take a certain viewpoint, but merely to present to you an idea worthy of consideration by every Christian. Is this the face of Jesus Christ? This cloth is the most scientifically studied object in history. We can see that it is obviously worth knowing something about. Today we have examined 2 questions concerning the Shroud of Turin. What is it, and is it authentic? But before we go, I'd like to ask you one more. What is it that you believe?